Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. It is July 9th, 2024. I'm Kathleen Newman, and this is Maine's Great Opera Divas with Arlene Palmer Schwind. Before we go any further into our program, let's just take a moment to remember and to recognize that MHS recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. This talk is part of our series on music in Maine, a companion program series to our exhibit Music in Maine, which if you haven't had a chance to visit yet at MHS, I hope you will soon. It's going to be open through the end of the year, through December. And you can purchase tickets online and learn more about the exhibit if you visit our website, mainhistory.org. And one of the music stories of Maine that's featured in that exhibit and that we're going to talk about tonight is about opera in Maine. And it might seem to some of us kind of unusual that a small state like Maine can claim connections with several opera divas, who enjoyed international fame between the 1870s and the 1920s. But that's who we're going to talk about tonight. And so our guest speaker, Arlene Palmer Schwind, is here with us. She is the president of Opera Maine and serves on the National Trustee Council of Opera America. Trained as a decorative arts historian in the Winterthur program of the University of Delaware. Excuse me, I'm a little tongue-tied tonight. She was the curator at the Winterthur Museum and then served as curator of Victoria Mansion. Arlene has lectured and published widely on a wide variety of art-related topics, including a recent essay about Maine sculptor Paul Akers. And her current project is a book on Italian decorative painters and scenic artists who worked in the United States between 1820 and 1880. She joins us tonight to talk about Maine's opera divas. Thank you, Arlene, so much for being here.
Thank you, Kathleen. I want to congratulate the Maine Historical Society on such an incredible exhibition for music in Maine, and thank you for having me be a part of your programming. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss 5 famous prime donne who had close ties to Maine: Annie Louise Cary, Lillian Nordica, Emma Eames, Olive Fremstad, and Lillian Blauvelt. Please understand this is going to be a summary. I could easily talk for an hour or more on each one of these singers. I have used secondary sources, memoirs, period newspaper accounts, period reviews, and there's an important collection about Lillian Blauvelt that has just recently been given to Maine Historical Society by a member of the family. That has been very helpful. Unfortunately, surviving recordings of their voices do not begin to do justice to their exceptional talents. There are some, but they're not wonderful. The early recording equipment just doesn't do justice to the female voice in particular. Our divas were born over 3 succeeding decades, from 1841 to 1873. Each woman was dedicated to her art and driven to succeed. Each had a fascinating and complicated, almost operatic life, of which I can only give you a glimpse. Our first prima donna, which is not moving here. Here we go. Our first prima donna was Annie Louise Cary, a contralto or mezzo-soprano who was born in Wayne, Maine in 1841. Annie's family had musical interest and talent. After studying at the Gorham Female Seminary, she went to Boston to be with her brother and his wife, who was studying singing. Annie took voice lessons as well and sang in several church choirs and small concerts, and made her professional debut singing the Messiah with the Handel and Haydn Society in 1862. Here's an ad for the program and a view of the music hall where it was performed. Annie determined to go to Europe to further her vocal education, and in 1866 she traveled to Milan. It was remarkable that as a young unmarried woman, she did this on her own. As we shall see, some of our other divas were always accompanied by their mothers. For 18 months, Annie studied with a teacher in Milan, and then an Italian troupe engaged her for a Scandinavian tour. So under the italicized name of Louise Cary, she made her operatic stage debut in Copenhagen in January of 1868, I believe as Azucena, a role from Verdi's Il Trovatore. She also sang in Stockholm, where she was presented to the king. Before returning to Scandinavia for the next opera season, she went to Baden-Baden to train under Pauline Viardot, whose portrait you see here. She was a renowned singer and composer, sister of the legendary Maria Malibran, both of them daughters of Manuel Garcia, who was the man who brought the first Italian opera to America in 1825. In Brussels, Annie sang the role of Zerlina in Don Giovanni, and after further study in Paris and London, she debuted at Covent Garden in 1870 in the pants role of Maffeo Orsini in Donizetti's opera Lucrezia Borgia. Her success there led the superstar soprano Christine Nilsson to ask Annie to join her upcoming American tour. Annie's first appearance in New York City was in a Steinway Hall concert with Nilsson in September of 1870, and then she toured the country performing in concerts. A review in a Boston paper said, "Her throat is lined with molten pearls." In November 1870, she sang her first professional concert for a Maine audience at Portland City Hall. Here's the program for it. And over her 14-year career, she would frequently return to her native state to give concerts. You see from the 1878 concert programs. Annie's debut on the American opera stage occurred in 1871 as Nancy in Friedrich von Flotow's opera Martha. As a member of the Strakos Grand Italian Opera Company in the 1871-72 season in New York and on tour, Cary performed such roles as the Queen in the American premiere of Thomas' opera Hamlet and the trouser role of Cybele in Gounod's Faust, as well as Lady Allcash in Auber's comic opera Fra Diavolo. By this time, she had gained national attention. She was praised for having a cultivated and flexible voice of great power and range, 3.5 octaves, and was said to be a natural actress. Her physical appearance was also noted. A New Orleans critic said that besides having a sweet, melodious voice, full and distinct with thrilling timbre, she was beautiful in form and feature, regal in her appearance. In November of, when she was 32 years old, this Queen of Contraltos, as she was known, was selected to sing the role of Amneris, the Egyptian princess, in the American premiere of Verdi's Aida at the Academy of Music in New York, a premiere that preceded that in London and Paris. You have to love this costume. It is extraordinary, and the striped shoes are just not to be believed. And this is of particular interest to me, and because Opera Maine is going to be presenting Aida this month, July 25 and 28. And it is thrilling to know that the first Amneris heard in the US and one who triumphed in the role and set the standard for decades was a Maine woman. The opera was staged at the New York Academy of Music. The Met Opera didn't exist at this time, and it was a huge 4,000-seat auditorium. But Annie's strong and wonderfully rich, clear voice was heard to full advantage, and her acting was declared the best in the opera. She continued to perform the role throughout her career. Here's an 1880 program in which she played Amneris as well. In March 1874, she tackled her only Wagnerian role, that of Ortrud, in Lohengrin, and as such was the first American woman to sing a Wagner opera. Now, this was a production sung in Italian, also at the Academy of Music. One reviewer said that Annie proved herself a thorough artist, but she felt, and another felt, that Cary was a true contralto, and the role of Ortrud was a bit, quote, beyond her compass. That was a phrase they would use to suggest that it was a little bit out of her range, maybe a little too high for her. While she most often performed in the Academy of Music, she also sang in Booth's Theater in New York, seen here in gorgeous watercolors at the time it opened in 1869, which were painted by the theater's resident scenic artist, Charles Witham, who happened to be a native of Portland, Maine. Notice here in the ad for the program, she is described as America's greatest contralto. Besides singing Amneris and Ortrud, Annie took on at least two other operatic roles in the 1873-74 season, and these were both trouser roles, Frederick in Mignon by Thomas, and also Urbano in Meyerbeer's Huguenots. Like all of our divas, she spent a lot of time traveling, mostly on trains, fraught with issues. In 1875, she was on the express train from Boston to New York when it was derailed. Also on the train was the vice president of the country, Henry Wilson, and the Speaker of the House, who was Maine's own James G. Blaine, who happened to be sitting near her. Blaine was thrown forward and hit with a seat that came loose, but Annie escaped with only a minor bruise. Celebrities like Annie got a lot of attention. People wrote music in her honor. Here are a group of Cary waltzes, for example. Some gave her very tangible tokens of their admiration. As this bottom notice suggests, Boston friends presented her with a pair of beautiful diamond eardrops. Like some of our other singers we'll discuss tonight, she found a warm reception in St. Petersburg, where she performed in operas for two seasons, 1875-76 and 1876-77. The enthusiasm was so great that she was overwhelmed with floral gifts and was called before the curtain 9 times. In between those two seasons in Russia, she continued to hone her art and studied in Vienna. When she returned to the US, she sang in the Bates College commencement concert, which also had the younger Lillian Norton, soon to be Nordica, the only time when they sang, known where they sang together. Both were in a quartet from Beethoven's Fidelio, and Herman Kochmar was the pianist. In 1880, Annie added a role from Boito's Mephistopheles to her resume, but she soon began to have problems with her throat. Her last opera appearance was in 1881 in Philadelphia, and she retired shortly thereafter and married a banker. She was the only one of our divas who seems to have had a happy marriage, and she was the only one who had only one husband. Annie died in 1921 in Connecticut and bequeathed this fine portrait of Longfellow by George Healy to the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, where it is today. Annie Louise Cary retired as the golden age of divas was getting underway. Nordica, Eames, Fremstad, and Blauvelt were the rock stars of their day. The details of their careers, as well as all aspects of their personal lives, became fair game for the press. They performed so often and toured so extensively that they were household names across the country. Small town newspapers carried reports of their doings. They achieved success and international fame because of an amazing work ethic and grueling schedules. Just in the month of December 1898, for example, Nordica sang 4 different Wagner heroines, and the same month, Emma Eames performed 5 roles. In 1 month on tour with the Met in 1907, Fremstad sang in 7 different cities, from St. Paul to Atlanta, and Blauvelt sang over 30 concerts in the UK in a little over a month. These women had stamina. Maine's best-known diva, soprano Lillian Nordica, came into the world in Farmington, Maine in 1857 as Lillian Norton. Her birthplace has been a museum devoted to her since 1928, and it is filled with fascinating objects and memorabilia, including many of her costumes and her stage jewelry, which is just astonishing. In the process of my research on Nordica, I was thrilled to discover that I am her sixth cousin, 3 times removed. When Lillian was 7, the Norton family moved to Boston. Lillian's older sister, Wilhelmina, was thought to be a musical genius whose talent would support the family. She attended the New England Conservatory of Music, but in 1869, at 17, she tragically died of typhoid. People then started paying attention to Lillian and realized she too had a vocal gift. So when she was 14, she started studying at New England Conservatory. Her 4 years there under an exacting taskmaster were challenging, as she said, stained with tears and sodden with discouragement. You see her graduation diploma here. After she graduated, she went to New York to train under an Italian opera singer and learn 12 soprano roles. Then for the next 2 years, her training took an unusual turn. She joined P.S. Gilmore's band as the soprano singer, and she and her mother traveled with the band all over the country and across Europe. In 6 weeks in 1878, she performed in 65 concerts throughout the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Lillian left the band in Paris, where she embarked on a rigorous and costly course of study, not just singing, but also acting in the French language. Then she moved to Milan to study with the fabled San Giovanni. And in 1879, at age 22, she made her professional debut on the opera stage in Milan's Teatro Manzoni, singing the role of Donna Elvira in Mozart's Don Giovanni. And she was the only one of the many female singers in that opera who was not hissed by the audience. This did not deter her, though. The following month, she gave a wildly acclaimed performance as Violetta in La Traviata in Brescia. She was such a hit that she had to encore every one of her arias. By this time, San Giovanni had convinced his pupil to change her name to something that Italians could easily pronounce. So Norton became Nordica, and it was under that name that her career began in earnest. From her debut in 1879 to her retirement in 1913, a 34-year career on stage, she performed at least 41 different principal roles. These included, in this early period in Italy, Marguerite in Gounod's Faust, Alice in Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable, and Gilda in Verdi's Rigoletto. Her success in Italy led to an invitation from St. Petersburg, too, and Nordica and her mother spent the seasons of 1880, 81, and 81, 82 in Russia, where she performed as Feline in the Opera Maine, and Amelia in Verdi's Ballo and Mascara, and in 3 Meyerbeer operas. In Huguenots, which you see here, she sang the role of Marguerite de Valois, the Queen of Navarre. Do note Turk the Poodle in the picture of Feline. She also sang in the Meyerbeer opera of L'Africaine. She sang the role of Inez. Russian audiences also heard her sing 2 Mozart roles that it is hard to imagine one singer performing. The mezzo-soprano role of Cherubino from Le Nozze di Figaro, Marriage of Figaro, and the stratospheric soprano role of Queen of the Night in Magic Flute, which you see her in her costume of that here. She also sang in lesser-known operas, so by the time she was 25, she had performed 16 different opera roles. Word of her talent was spreading, and in 1882, she debuted with the incomparable Paris Opera in the role of Marguerite in Faust. Faust was essentially the French national opera, and she passed the test with the audiences. Her success and fame was such that a couturier designed a new style of opera cloak known as La Nordica, and there was even a color dubbed La Nordica. She would later sing to acclaim Gounod's other famous soprano role, that of Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. Nordica made her American debut in 1883 as Marguerite, not at the Metropolitan Opera, which had just opened, but at the Academy of Music. It was not a particular success. The critics said that though her voice had beauty and purity, it was destitute of dramatic force, and her acting was inadequate. She also married that year, and that didn't go well either. Fred Gower was a cousin connected with Thomas Edison, and soon he wanted her to stop singing, even to the point of burning her scores and her costumes. Wisely, she left him, and in 1885, he went up in a balloon ascension across the English Channel, never to be seen again. This is stuff you could not make up. Nordica wrote the music to this song, Enduring Love, and it's rather poignant because enduring love was the one thing she never enjoyed. She had 3 unhappy marriages. By January 1886, Nordica had joined Mapleson's Her Majesty's Opera Company and sang a number of Italian coloratura roles, including Violetta and Lucia de Lammermoor. And with that company, she debuted in the title role of Verdi's Aida at London's Drury Lane Theatre in 1887. It was not a wildly successful debut, but when she sang the role in New York at the Met in the 1890s, she made a good impression and was considered one of the best Aidas of the time. Between 1894 and 1906, she sang Aida in 29 performances at the Met, and it was a role she also performed on tour all over the country. In May 1888, she debuted at Covent Garden in London as Carmen, traditionally a mezzo-soprano role, which may be why she only sang it once. But that was followed by Salika, the lead soprano role in Meyerbeer's L'Africaine, a role which demands fabulous costume and jewels. And the jewels remain at the homestead in Farmington, and they are astonishing. Her scepter, her necklace, her armbands, it is just out of this world. After visiting Bayreuth in 1888, Nordica determined to sing the music of Wagner. She started studying the role of Elsa von Brabant in Lohengrin, and in 1889 debuted in that role at Covent Garden, singing, as was the fashion, not in German, but in Italian. She made her debut at the Metropolitan Opera in 1891 in the Meyerbeer's Huguenots, but by December 1893, she was singing Elsa there frequently. And it was after a performance of Lohengrin a few years later that her fans presented her with a diamond tiara made by Tiffany with 233 diamonds set in platinum that cost $5,000. Positive reports of Nordica's talents led Cosima Wagner, widow of the composer Richard Wagner, to audition her in the summer of 1892. Cosima was seeking someone to sing Elsa in Bayreuth's first production of Lohengrin. She thought that Nordica's voice, intelligence, and capacity for expression were quite extraordinary and hired her as the first non-German to sing a principal role at Bayreuth. Nordica lived at Bayreuth for 3 months to prepare for the role in 1894. It was an exhausting and difficult rehearsal experience, during which she said she wept barrels of tears. But she triumphed in the performance in August of 1894 and won over all the doubters, including George Bernard Shaw, who had not been impressed with her in London, but now said she perfectly combined Italian singing with German music. And of course, she was singing in German at Bayreuth. German critics felt she surpassed all others in her dramatic concept. This is the crown that she can be seen wearing in her Lohengrin outfit on the left. And here she is with the 2 tenors who alternated in the title role in that historic 1894 performance. Nordica was praised for her flawless German diction, and a few years later, she sang the role in French at the Paris Opera. Her second Wagnerian role was as Venus in Tannhäuser at the Met in 1894. And according to the New York Herald, she was vocally irreproachable with a seductive tone and a sensuous beauty that produced shivers of delight. She prepared for another Wagner role, that of Isolde, from Tristan und Isolde, with Anton Seidl, who had been Wagner's assistant at Bayreuth in 1876. In New York, he conducted many Wagner operas at the Metropolitan, and he trained Nordica, Eames, and Fremstad. Nordica recalled that he not only went over her singing in detail, but also her acting. She was well prepared for the opening, but even so, she said, and I quote, "No one can know what it felt like to lie on that couch and hear the prelude progressing bar after bar and the sign given for the curtain to go up. They were awful moments." She may have been fearful, but she triumphed in the role when the opera opened in November 1895. The New York Times reported that Nordica, quote, "simply amazed those who thought they had measured the full limit of her powers." The Tribune gushed, "The greater the demand, the larger her capacity." In the climaxes of the first act, in which Isolde rages like a tempest, her voice rang out with a thrilling clearness, power, and brilliancy. Here's a detail of showing her with the crown and the necklace that she wore as Isolde. And remarkably, these are part of the Homestead collection. From the late 1890s, Nordica was famous for performing the three roles of Brunhilde in the Wagner Ring cycle. As critics said, she was gloriously equal to the vocal demands and has the Wagner spirit and letter of the law to the last essence. Diva intrigue at the Met kept her from making her expected debut as the Siegfried Brunhilde in 1896, though she took some consolation in the fact that her rival, Nellie Melba, failed miserably in the role. Nordica quit the Met over this flap, and with entrepreneurial flair, she instead organized a cross-country tour for herself and earned a lot of money. And in this period, May of 1896, she remarried a Hungarian tenor named Zoltán Döme. Fences were mended with the Met, and she was back there singing Brunhilde in Siegfried and Götterdämmerung in February of 1898. And she soon became renowned all over the world as Brunhilde, with audiences typically breaking into wild applause at her Walküre cry. Perhaps most notable was a ring cycle in Munich in 1903, when she sang the three Brunhilde roles on 3 consecutive nights. Nordica was so attached to the role of Brunhilde that she named her private railway car the Brunhilde. The Nordica homestead also has one of her original Brunhilde metal shirts and helmet. The feathers aren't original, but that's the helmet. Nordica was an artist whose interpretation of roles evolved over time. A critic wrote in 1900 that under her steady striving after an ideal, her creation of Brunhilde continues to grow. In her posthumously published Hints to Singers, Nordica devoted a chapter to singing Wagner. Not only do the Wagnerian roles require great physical strength, the endurance to be on one's feet for so many hours, but also the challenge of managing many props, including, in her case, a live horse. Musically, she said, supreme control was required to maintain a beautiful tone quality, and the music is difficult. In Brunhilde's immolation scene in Götterdämmerung, there are 17 key changes and 9 time changes. Speaking of the immolation scene, at a matinee of Götterdämmerung at the Met, 1905, a chorister accidentally set the stage on fire. At the very moment, Nordica had taken a torch and was about to light Siegfried's funeral pyre. So there she was, singing about the god of fire and her own imminent death by fire, and she gathers up her flimsy dress, darts across the stage, pushes people aside as she goes, stamps out the flame, scorches her dress, all the while singing in perfect tone and tempo. She then reached the climax of her music and ran into the funeral pyre. The audience went absolutely nuts, standing, cheering, clapping, throwing flowers, calling her back again and again. Although an acclaimed interpreter of heroic and dramatic Wagnerian roles, she remarkably and perhaps uniquely continued to sing Mozart and Verdi through the 1900s in the 1900s at the Met. Early in 1904, she sought a divorce from Dome, who had given up his own opera career to happily spend all of her hard-earned money. He threatened to kill her if she did divorce him. And as you see here, there was also a rumor suddenly that husband number one was actually alive. He was the one who went off in the balloon ascension. He wasn't. But somehow, with all of this distraction and nonsense, Nordica managed to learn the difficult role of Kundry in Wagner's Parsifal, and she performed it at the Met in November of 1904. This picture shows her in Act Two when she is the seductress Kundry. Her elegant costume was made to her specifications by Worth of Paris, and it was set off. You see her, here's a detail of her headdress. It was designed in beads to be lilies. 1904 also saw Nordica in the title role of La Gioconda at the Met with Enrico Caruso as her tenor. There she is in that role, and there's the costume on the left. And on the right is one of the many trunks, huge trunks that carried her costumes. I was intrigued to learn that much of the time, our divas designed their own costumes. They would do research and study paintings in museums to ensure historical accuracy. Of course, in those days, there was no question of what period an opera would represent, because each was presented as the composer and librettist envisioned it. Even while she was performing opera across the country and around the world, Nordica also maintained a concert schedule and was particularly active in that capacity in the 1905 to 13 period. She was so well known that she was one of the first celebrities to endorse commercial products, Coca-Cola, and a weight loss powder. She had her issues with new technology. She discovered at a concert in Wichita that telephone transmitters had been hidden around the hall, and her concert was being transmitted without her knowledge or permission all over the country via telephone. In 1913, she went on a concert tour to Australia and the South Seas. She left Sydney on a ship that was then wrecked on a reef en route to Java. She was saved, but sick. She caught pneumonia. It was just ghastly. They got her finally to Batavia, where she died by inches several months later. Headlines of her demise shown here from across the country. And the husband mentioned there, sued by the estate, would be her third husband, who made off with her jewels, her fortune, and even her ashes. Emma Eames was born 8 years after Nordica in 1865 in Shanghai. Her mother had been raised in Bath, Maine, so when Emma was a small child and they left China, they returned to Maine. After a time in Portland, Emma was sent to live with her very strict grandparents in Bath, but rather curiously, in that house shown here, but rather curiously, she returned to Portland twice a week to study music with her mother. Between 1882 and 85, Emma lived in Boston and had private vocal training. She saw her first operas, both by Wagner. She made her stage debut in concert with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and through connections with the symphony, secured a place in Paris with a famous voice teacher, Madame Marchesi, whom Emma called a Prussian drill master. And it was in her studio that an icy rivalry developed with none other than Nellie Melba. Emma's mother accompanied her to Europe, and before commencing her studies, they went to Bayreuth. The singer recalled later that she was entranced by how the Bayreuth singers totally lost themselves in their roles. This is so interesting and rather sad, because the major criticism leveled at Emma throughout her 20-year career was her inability to transform herself into the character. She was coached by composer Charles Gounod himself for the role of Marguerite in his opera Faust, but she made her debut in the Paris Opera in 1889 in his other major opera, Romeo and Juliet. This was not the happiest experience. She had no orchestra rehearsal or stage direction, and just before going on stage, she was badgered by male patrons who were allowed to wander around backstage. Never mind that the backstage facilities left a lot to be desired, like plumbing. Still, she was performing the role as much as 10 times in a month. She also sang in a chanson opera Ascanio, which I know nothing about, but I love the costume. That's the picture on the right. 1891 was an important year for Emma Eames. At 26, she made her debut at Covent Garden as Marguerite in Faust. And in spite of intrigue from Melba, and perhaps because the Prince of Wales was a good friend of hers, she contracted to sing other roles that season. The Royal Opera House experience was not the most comfortable either. In her words, their dressing rooms were like dog kennels. She performed Elsa in Lohengrin, the title role of Gounod's Mireille, and Desdemona in Otello. One day after singing Desdemona the night before, she eloped with Julian Story, of whom her mother did not approve. He was an artist and son of the highly regarded American sculptor, William Wetmore Story. He painted this beautiful portrait of Emma. They lived rather grandly in Paris and Italy, but were often apart. 1891 was also the year she made her Metropolitan Opera debut, the same year as Nordica, but her first performances were with the company on tour in Chicago in the role of Elsa in Lohengrin. One critic complained that none of the cast of this production was able to break away from the old-fashioned Italian traditions, which he clearly felt were unsuitable for German music. Although Emma sang with care and earnestness, she was, quote, not especially expressive, nor was she dramatically picturesque or vigorous. While she was in Chicago, Emma also took on her first role in a Verismo opera, that of Santuzza, in the Metropolitan Opera's premiere production of Cavalleria Rusticana. She sang with the Met almost her entire career. From 1891-92 season to the 1908-9 season, she appeared in over 20 roles in 439 performances. Her work included the US premieres of Massenet's Werther, in which she performed as Charlotte, which is usually today certainly a mezzo-soprano role. And she also was in the US premiere of Verdi's Falstaff, in which she sang Alice Ford. It's hard to believe, but the Metropolitan Opera's first production of Mozart's Magic Flute, which was written in 1791, only occurred in 1900, and Emma Eames sang the role of Pamina. Emma sang the role of Eva in Wagner's Meistersinger at the Met, but she had already debuted in London in 1893. That season, 1893, she shared the Covent Garden stage with Nordica in a production of The Marriage of Figaro. She was the Countess to Nordica's Susanna. Later that year in New York, the two, who were said to be friends, sang together at the Met in another Mozart opera, Don Giovanni. Emma Eames also won praise for her exquisite singing and demeanor as Michaela in Carmen. Her next venture into Wagner was as Elizabeth in Tannhäuser, first in French in London, then at the Met in 1896 in Italian, but she soon determined that henceforth she would only sing German opera in German. The New York production was far from a success. The conductor was rebuked for listless dragging, lethargic heaviness. The Wolfram sang off pitch. The septet of the Knights was incompetently sung to its near ruin. The chorus was out of tune and shaky. So it is rather faint praise for that critic to say that Emma Eames was, quote, beyond and above all the other singers in artistic conception and in conscientious working out of her representation. Her voice was beautifully broad and sympathetic and vastly more powerful than in former years. Moreover, she looked the gentle princess to perfection. Anton Seidel was especially eager for Emma to sing Sieglinde in Die Walküre, which role she debuted in London in June 1898, and many felt this was her best Wagnerian role. Of her December 1898 performance with Nordica as Brunhilde, the Evening Post critic gushed that a more winsome, tender, pathetic, lifelike Sieglinde has never been seen on any stage. Her voice was laden with passion and ardor, and she was equal to the great moments of dramatic excitement. Well, this review was an anomaly. Emma gave a lot of thought and study into her interpretations, but once she decided on who a character was and how to play her, she always represented her in exactly the same way. Her characterizations never evolved. Worse, she never truly inhabited a role. Admirers hoped that Wagner's operas would help help in this regard, but they were disappointed. A critic said there was no change in her except a growth in tonal opulence and technical mastery. She was still a lovely woman with a lovely voice and a lovely art, which she kept disassociated from the creation of the dramatist and composer. It was sad because in her memoir in 1899 interview, she said that the highest achievement of the singer's art comes with the successful interpretation of roles, and that for her, singing was always secondary to acting. She was trained not to sing and gesture at the same time, which meant she didn't move very much. Her fans considered her statuesque, but to others, she was merely stiff as a statue. And some blamed her glacial onstage presence on her childhood in the cold Maine climate. One disgruntled audience member wrote the New York newspaper saying that Emma simply had to learn to put more fire and feeling into her acting as well as her voice. Her facial expressions never changed. She was always Emma Eames, never the character. And I think you see a bit of that in her pose here as Aida, which she debuted in 1900 and sang at the Met 36 times until 1909. Some considered hers the best after Nordica's, and she was especially admired for her extremely artistic costume. But the exotic costume aside, she was still Emma Eames. Someone called a night watching her Aida performance was like ice skating on the Nile. When she debuted Tosca at the Met, a critic wrote that all was studied, unstable, unconvincing, unmoving. She never showed real tragedy or dramatic growth, yet the voice thrilled. And Puccini himself thought she was magnificent in the role. She may not have emoted much on stage, but in her private life, she could be explosive, as these press clippings indicate. The press also fixated on the glamorous trappings of her success, that her Paris gowns cost $1,000 to $5,000 each, for example, or that she set a record for the amount of luggage, 36 trunks, ever carried on a particular ocean liner. When she made a great concert tour, she was accompanied by her own chef and steward from her Paris home, as well as a pianist, a cellist, and the baritone Emilio de Gogorza. Which brings up Emma's love life. Emma divorced Julian Story in 1907, and she spent that summer in Bar Harbor preparing the title role in Mascagni's opera Iris that she chose to do instead of Madama Butterfly. But 2 years later, the wife of de Gogorza sued Emma for alienating the baritone's affections as a, quote, psychic co-respondent. The wife claimed no immorality on Emma's part, but said that because her husband was Emma's soulmate in a truly artistic sense, it killed the love he once had for her. Emma herself said that when she was on stage with de Gogorza, she found her most responsive chords when her own notes came in reply to his. So not surprisingly, those two soulmates became engaged, but it took 2 years for the Gogorza divorce to go through and much complication with the Catholic Church in France before they could marry. And this all happened just a year after Emma experienced a major trauma. She was touring with the Met Company in San Francisco when the great earthquake and devastating fire hit the city on April 18th, 1906. Her tale of escape, which she records in her memoirs, from the city is absolutely chilling. She was not injured, but it took its toll, and it cost her 27 trunks and costumes for 3 operas. Amazingly, Olive Fremstad was also in San Francisco that fateful day. Less than 12 hours before the devastation, she was performing as Carmen with Enrico Caruso. Plus, she was a bride of only 3 days. Still, somehow, a review of her Carmen performance managed to be published, which said she never got under the skin of the role. but that was highly unusual. She was always hailed as quite the stage animal. She was no Emma Eames. Fremstad's ties to Maine are not by birth or family, but in 1912, she rented a camp on Long Lake and then bought property on Highland Lake in Bridgeton, where in 1915-16, she built this retreat called Nowandin. And here she is chopping wood on her property. Fremstad's operatic career spanned 23 years, from her debut in Cologne in 1895 to 1918. She was a marvelously colorful character. One critic called her, quote, an epic sort of creature, moving most comfortably between heaven and earth. I highly recommend the lively biography written by her personal assistant, Mary Cushing, called The Rainbow Bridge. And Fremstad was also the inspiration for her friend Willa Cather's book, Song of the Lark. Fremstad was born out of wedlock as Anna Olivia Rundquist in Sweden in 1871. She was raised in Norway, and when she was 12, she came to Minnesota with her adoptive family, the Fremstads. She boldly went off on her own to New York at the age of 18 in 1890. She managed to connect with Anton Seidel, tour with his company, and then went to Germany, where she studied with the legendary Lily Lehmann. Like Annie Louise Cary, Fremstad made her operatic debut as Azucena, and in 1896, she sang some small contralto roles in the Ring Cycle at Bayreuth. But she must have had a tremendous range because she sang both mezzo and soprano repertoire throughout her career. She was best known as a Wagnerian diva. She sang 12 different roles from Wagner's operas, yet she was versatile enough to sing verismo roles like Tosca and Santuzza, and the Met even had her perform the title role of Gluck's 18th century opera, Armide. She made her Metropolitan Opera debut at 32 in 1903 as Sieglinde, and immediately captivated audiences both as a singer and an actress. Over the next 11 years, she went on to make 345 appearances on the Met stage. Her portrayal of Sieglinde was a believable woman of primal instincts and sorrows. Her voice, wrote a critic, is of extraordinarily beautiful quality and large range, with lower notes of the richest contralto coloring. Its freedom and flexibility, the volume with which she poured it out, the nobility and broad sweep of her phrasing, showed in her the artist who comprehends the essence and the significance of Wagner's musical style. Her success as Sieglinde was followed by another, as Venus, shown here. One reviewer suggested she may have overdone the heroic in some of her poses. This was not a role she loved. She hated having to sit quietly on the couch during the ballet, looking seductive, and she said all the time her throat was just tightening up. Her first role in Tristan and Isolde was in the mezzo role of the maid, Brangäne, in 1904, but 4 years later, she debuted as the soprano princess under the baton of Gustav Mahler. The Times reviewer said her Isolde was an original interpretation that revealed great dramatic gifts, accomplished stagecraft, and intelligence. Another wrote that her voice was of indescribable beauty in its richness and power, with infinite modulations in all the shades and extremes of dramatic significance. Kundry in Parsifal was a role which Fremstad thrillingly portrayed all over the US. This hugely demanding role requires the singer to be a wild woman, a seductress, and a penitent. She first sang it at the Met in December of 1904, just a few weeks after Nordica did, but hers was a very different being, and one that required massive backstage effort. To achieve her look of forest dirt in Act 1, she stained her skin. And after the act was over, she would stand naked in her dressing room while 3 or 4 women poured olive oil all over her body and rubbed the stain off with towels. She then transformed herself into the Act 2 Kundry you see here on the right. This also caused much angst for her team because she would create her costume anew at every performance. Assistants stood around with a glittering array of fabrics and accessories, and the diva would snatch this or that and arrange and drape it over herself, highlighting the ensemble with accessories like leopard paws and tons of jewelry. The result was applauded as quote, the sheer allurement of sex, a far cry from Nordica's classic and rather chaste Parisian creation. I mentioned her Carmen on that fateful night in San Francisco. She debuted the role at the Met in 1904, and the Times was vastly impressed with her interpretation. They said she exuded Mediterranean warmth and passion while abounding in subtleties and finesse. She set forth in a clear way and with a wealth of detail the essentially sensual nature of Carmen and the character's refinement of wanton wickedness. Speaking of wickedness, it was Olive Fremstad who introduced the most notorious female in opera to American audiences, Salome. She performed it only once in 1907 because the opera was immediately banned after that single performance and was not produced again at the Met until 1934. Fremstad's preparation for the role was so thorough that she even went to the city morgue to ascertain the weight of a human head so that she would know exactly how to stagger while carrying the platter with the head of John the Baptist. This is a view of that original stage set of that single performance, and you can see her there with holding the veil up in the center. In spite of the horror, disgust, and even nausea reported by the audience that night, a critic conceded that Madame Fremstad accomplished a miracle, a sleek tigress with seduction speaking in every pose, gesture, look, and utterance. She grew steadily in the monster. She later performed Salome with the Paris Opera. 1909 and 1910 saw her magnificent performance as Armide and a triumph as Tosca, with Caruso as her Cavaradossi. She looked, acted, and sang her part with radiance, intelligence, and style. Like Nordica, Fremstad eventually sang all three Brunhilde roles to great acclaim. In Die Walküre, she was girlish and energetic, leaping about the stage. But in terms of characterization, Fremstad considered the Götterdämmerung Brunhilde to be the pinnacle of her career, especially her performances at the 1912 Wagner Festival in Munich. But she had her issues with Brunhilde. All those rocks, the helmet wings muffled the sound of the orchestra. When she was prone within the ring of fire, her shield compressed her diaphragm. She got cold and stiff, waiting for Siegfried. And she always had to suppress her instinct to laugh when he did come and found out that she was a she. Then she had to sing in full voice and reach the heights of ecstasy. The last Wagner role Fremstad took on was curiously where Nordica and Eames had started, as the demure Elsa of Lohengrin. Not surprisingly, she succeeded in imbuing that somewhat colorless heroine with a kind of fiery tenderness and dignity. She debuted in 1909, and it was as Elsa that she made her final appearance on the Met stage in 1914, at the age of 43. The youngest of our prime donne was Lillian Blauvelt. Like Fremstad, her connections with Maine are indirect. She was born in Brooklyn, but members of her family started vacationing in Maine, and she often spent time with them on St. George's Lake in Liberty, Maine, and her sister lived in Belfast. Also, as these headlines indicate, she performed in concert in Portland multiple times, as well as in Bangor, Bar Harbor, and elsewhere in the 1890s and early 1900s. She was a beloved participant in the Maine musical festivals, and on at least one occasion, October 1897, as you see here, Nordica was also on the program. In Bangor, Blauvelt presented a benefit concert to help defray the debt of the recently built Bangor Auditorium, and in 1902, participated in a concert in Portland City Hall for the Ladies Longfellow Aid Committee to help with the costs of preserving the Wadsworth Longfellow House. Unlike the other divas we have looked at this evening, Blauvelt sang primarily on the concert stage rather than the opera stage. And she delighted audiences and won fame not only all over this country, but all over Europe as well. She was really something of a prodigy. She started violin lessons at 7 and was soon playing in concerts in New York. And then she started singing lessons at 13. The notice here is from when she sang in the Brooklyn Choral Society concert at the age of 14. Lillian was a student of the newly established National Conservatory of Music in America, and she soon switched her focus from the violin to the voice. When her voice teacher returned to Paris, she followed him to continue her training. Traveling with her was not her mother, but her husband, whom she had married at the age of 15. Besides her study in Paris, like the other divas, she spent formative time in Russia and was also able to work with Anton Rubinstein. When she was only 18 years old, Lillian made her debut on the opera stage, singing the title role of Gounod's opera Mireille at the Théâtre de la Monnaie in Brussels. She coached not only with Gounod, but also with such composers as Delibes and Thomas. After performing other opera roles that season, she returned to the US, where she started her career as a concert singer. By 1893, she had gained a reputation as a stellar soprano, consistently praised for her strong, pure, and lovely tone. That, combined with her extraordinary beauty and engaging persona, assured her success. In describing her rendition of Ophelia's mad scene from the opera Hamlet, a Portland reporter waxed on, saying, "The runs and trills of that mad scene poured from her beautiful throat like bird notes, and she took the highest in crescendo in a manner to electrify her hearers." As this slide demonstrates, she often included opera arias, but performed many art songs as well. After traveling to Fargo, North Dakota to obtain a divorce, this must have been the Reno of the day, Lillian returned to Europe for the 1898-99 season and soon married there for the second time. She performed in concerts and was notably the only non-Italian artist to sing at the Donizetti Festival in Bergamo. In 1905, she was the soprano selected to sing in a memorial concert for Verdi in Rome. Lillian sang for royalty in England, Italy, and Spain, and was honored by them. She sang at Windsor Castle for Queen Victoria, who presented her with a medal, which she's wearing in this photo. But the highest order she received was the Order of the Royal Academy of St. Cecilia of Rome, the oldest musical society in the world, and she was one of only 8 recipients of the award. In 1903, Lillian returned to the opera stage for a season and made her debut at the Royal Opera House in London. Her roles included Marguerite and Zerlina. The London press was mixed on her performance as Marguerite, saying that while her voice had a unique liquid charm and the Jewel song was sung so well that an encore was demanded, but her inexperience on the stage with regard to acting was obvious. It was said she lacked the dramatic impulse so necessary in opera, but she clearly improved as the run went on. She sang other roles, including Juliet. She also sang Michaela in Carmen. I don't know what role she's singing on the right, but I had to show this picture because the hat is so extraordinary. By the fall of 1904, Lillian was back on the concert tour, and this gives you an idea of her insane schedule, the 30 concerts in little more than a month, all over the UK. Back in the US, she continued touring, and in 1905 decided that her métier might be light opera or operetta. She signed a 6-year contract to perform in comic opera and to tour in concert, for which she was to receive the staggering amount of $500,000 or $2,000 a week. She is shown here as Elsa in Victor Herbert's The Magic Night, which was a parody of Wagner's Lohengrin. It ran for 102 performances, and another comic opera, The Rose of Alhambra, in which she starred, also proved to be a popular success. Here she is on the cover of a New York magazine in 1908 in bejeweled splendor. Our divas were all celebrities and got a lot of press attention. Here's a 1903 headline about how she missed her pets, 2 dogs, a bird, and a cat, because she couldn't take them on tour. She was traveling from Maine to California and Minnesota to Texas and couldn't take them along. The press also carried the story of her 5-hour dockside fight with custom officials who wanted to charge her duties on the 107 gowns she had brought with her from Europe. Lillian's second marriage ended in divorce, and in 1914, she married the Serbian composer and conductor Alexander Savin. She starred in the premiere of his opera Xenia that was held in Zurich and wrote some of the lyrics. The premiere was met with endless applause and great ovations. It was said the sheer beauty of Lillian's voice captivated the hearts of her listeners. In the end, that is what all of our divas desired and constantly strove for, to capture the hearts of their listeners and bring beautiful music to the world. They all succeeded, each on her own fascinating and often challenging path to fame. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Arlene. That was fantastic. Um, these performers certainly lived some really interesting lives, and we're getting some good questions from the audience. Can you comment on Lillian Nordica's role in the suffrage movement at all?
Yes, I couldn't, as I said, I could have talked for hours just on her. She was, there's a great photograph of her as, uh, in the suffragette movement. I don't know, I have a lot of detail about it, but there's the biography by Ira Glackens called Yankee Diva, has more information about that.
Now, someone else was asking something I was wondering too. Is it common for opera singers like these for them to obtain possession of their jewelry and their costumes like Nordica did?
Well, this, as I said, this was kind of new to me. I'm thinking today when opera companies have costume departments and they provide the costumes and all of that. But in at this period, no, they did their own costumes. And then so she had her Violetta dress and she traveled with the Violetta dress. She had her Aida costume, she traveled with that and provided the jewelry and everything else. And it didn't stay with the company, it went
It
with the
stayed
diva.
with her, yeah, with
Yeah.
them. Interesting. Someone else is asking, did any of these women have children? If they did, how did they combine like motherhood with a career on the road like this?
They all had multiple husbands except for Annie Louise Cary. None of them had children.
None of them had children. Um, is there a museum of opera? I don't know if we're talking about specifically in Maine or just maybe in the United States, but
Um, Not that I know of. I mean,
you know,
there are, the Metropolitan Opera always has a little exhibit of something there. The Opera America headquarters usually has a small exhibition of opera related things, but um, I'm drawing a blank
yeah,
on
that's okay. And
opera
there's Lillian
museum.
Nordica, her homestead is in
The homestead is,
Farmington, right?
and which is very unusual. Marcella Sembrick was a leading uh singer in this period too, and I haven't been to it, but her house in New York State apparently has a number of her possessions as well.
Someone else asking, I know you mentioned that there were audio recordings of some of these women. Are there any film clips of their performances anywhere?
Mm,
Maybe like silent movies or
mm-mm,
yeah.
no,
Right. Well,
not that I know of.
thank you so much, Arlene. This was such a rich and interesting presentation. We really appreciate you sharing this with us tonight. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, like anything that's coming up from Opera Maine that we should know about? Um,
Well, as I said, well, this Friday there's going to be a concert with two of our singers in Waldoboro, Maine. If any of you out there are from that part of the world, um, do try to attend that. It's at the Waldo Theater at 7:30. And then, of course, our main feature is Aida, and tickets are going really fast for July 25 and 28.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you again. This was really delightful. And thank you to our audience for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. And I hope we'll see everybody back here real soon.
Thank you, Kathleen, very much.
It was our pleasure.